The US business community is having its say, but will their voices be heard? Facing the prospect that another $300 billion worth of Chinese goods may soon be slapped with 25% new tariffs, the US Trade Representative's office has opened its office for 1 week of public hearings. More than 660 US companies and associations have already expressed their opposition through a campaign called Tariffs Hurt the Heartland. Yet, will their views be snubbed? Meanwhile, the US suspended its intellectual property case against China at the World Trade Organization. What's the significance? I'm joined in the Beijing studio by Qinduo, a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, a Beijing-based think tank, and from Philadelphia, US, by Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Group, a consultancy. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, first, let's talk about the US Trade Representative public hearings. Brandon, how important is this hearing?
This is important. It's not going to derail President Trump's plans. What it is going to do is going to give us an indication about what public perception is going to be about these trade tariffs. For the time being, the public has generally supported President Trump. Particularly rural Americans have really said, look, we may not like the tariffs, but we like how Trump is acting. We like how he's being tough. We like that he's making these broad proclamations. And the business community has largely gone along with it. You have many companies like New Balance shoes that early on were huge proponents of these tariffs. Now, you're starting to see a huge shift. New Balance shoes, for example, one of his biggest proponents of tariffs just a year ago, is now one of the leaders of this coalition saying, look, 25%, too much. You cannot be putting these on here. We are not going to be able to open up a new factory inside the United States if we can't import smaller parts and pieces from China. This is hurting our business. And so these hearings are going to tell us what the next 3 to 6 months is going to be in the business community and whether they're actually going to support these tariffs or whether they're going to become major critics of the administration.
Well, last August, when the USTR held public hearings for imposing tariffs on Chinese goods worth a total of $200 billion, over 90% of voices were against it, but in vain. Brandon, can we expect a different result this time?
No. I mean, this is President Trump we're talking about. His administration has decided to do what it wants to do, regardless of who supports it or not, because
but what's the point of public hearings,
when he feels like he's being put upon. And so all he's going to do is blame the media.
What's the point of public hearings?
Because it's the show on pomp and circumstance. If he didn't... Some of this is legally required. Some of this is the USTR has to follow certain formats to allow people to express their frustration. But President Trump is under no legal obligation to follow this, just as any other president wasn't. But he's particularly the type to just basically go, meh, they don't know what they're talking about. I know what's best for the economy.
Well, as I mentioned a week ago, a total of 520 companies, including some of the nation's most recognizable brands, plus 140 trade associations at the national and state level sent a jointly signed letter to the USTR as well as the White House. Qinduo, what do you make of the scale of the voice of opposition and the way it was presented as a joint letter signed by so many companies together instead of individual voices? What's the consideration behind that?
Well, compared with the last round for the hearing in August, if we can quantify that, 90% of the representatives basically expressed opposition to the tariffs. But now you are seeing, I would say, louder and a louder voice against upcoming tariffs on the remaining $300 billion worth of Chinese products over there. Remember, for the last rounds of tariffs, some of the products from China were exempted because it's related to people's daily lives. But if we are going to have further tariffs, they will be included. So I think that's the deep concern and also the fear of some of the even small firms over there.
Basically, what's on the line here, 60% are consumer products. So indeed, if these tariffs indeed go ahead, there will be some catastrophic consequences. Let's look at what was written in this letter. For instance, it says these businesses and trade associations, it says says, we know firsthand that the additional tariffs will have a significant negative and long-term impact on American businesses, farmers, families, and the U.S. economy. Broadly applied tariffs are not an effective tool to change China's unfair trade practices. Tariffs are taxes paid directly by U.S. companies, including those listed below, and not China. And yet, the U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said on Monday during an interview that the U.S. president is perfectly happy with continuing the tariff movements that we've already announced, as well as imposing the new ones that he's temporarily suspended. His remarks also echoed previous remarks by the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, who also talked about the president being perfectly happy if things don't go in the right direction. Brandon, is happy the right word here? I mean, for the Trump administration, it's probably just signing on a piece of paper, but for a lot of businesses, this probably mean their livelihood.
It does. But President Trump and his administration have expressed basic glee. I'm going to call it glee. When they get to look and act tough, and when they get to blame somebody, be it Mexico, be it immigrants, be it the Chinese economy, be it the media, be it any political opponent, he looks happy and he acts happy. He's happy to look tough and act tough. The problem is he has minimal connection to actually what's good for the economy. He loves to tout how high the stock market is. He loves to tout how his tax cuts helped major companies just reap huge financial benefits, when in reality, if we're going to slap this final amount of tariffs on the remaining $300 billion, you're not just hurting big companies, you're hurting Main Street. These consumer goods are what people buy at Target, Costco, Walmart. These are goods that smaller companies are importing in small pieces to assemble and use in manufacturing in the United States. Even companies that are building things in the United States are still importing goods from China to help them build those goods. We live in a globalized economy, and President Trump and his financial leaders have repeatedly shown that they do not understand it. Their top tariff negotiator once said, no one will ever retaliate once we put tariffs on. That was so incredibly idiotically wrong that it begs the question of why we're even listening to these people when they're making predictions. The reality is they want tariffs because they think it makes them look tough. President Trump's about to go back on official campaigning in the middle of the country, and all he cares about is looking like a bully.
Obviously, at least the trade war turned out not to be so easy to win. The U.S. National Retail Federation said in an official statement that the latest tariff escalation is far too great a gamble for the U.S. economy. A report commissioned by the Federation found that if the tariffs did go ahead, an average U.S. household of 4 people would pay additional $2,000 for their daily necessities. So, Qinduo, is that what President Trump really prepared to do to the American people? Does he have any alternative?
Well, he could go ahead and with that extra tariff. Remember, if you look at the past behavior, I agree with Brandon that despite all the opposition, he will go ahead with the tariffs. And also with the latest example, what he did to Mexico. Basically, he bullied Mexico into some concessions to help him with migrants from Latin American countries. So he would tout that as some achievement with the tariff. So he would say, tariff works. For example, Mexico is a case in point. So I will continue with that with the Chinese. But if you look at the issue from the Chinese perspective, if you read the Chinese media carefully, China is prepared for the worst. With actual tariffs or without actual tariffs, it doesn't really make a big difference right now.
Could there? However, I'm going to ask you this, Qinduo. Could there have been any other way to bring China to the negotiating table without using the tariffs?
Oh, of course. The best way to deal with the disputes between any trading partners is WTO. That's a multilateral framework.
People say that's too slow. That's too inefficient. It takes years to solve one small problem.
But look, we started the negotiation between the two countries a year ago, and what we have achieved, nothing. It is really the quickest means. Yes, with Mexico, that's quick because Mexico rely on the U.S. market for 80% 0% of their export to the U.S. market. But not China. China is no Mexico. Remember that. China is a sovereign nation which cherish very much about the sovereignty, independence. It has independent military. No, China is preparing for the worst. And if you look at the growing hostility from Washington.
So basically.
Yeah,
basically
people are questioning what's the point of giving up many of the concessions.
Basically, you can bring the horse to the water, but you can't force the horse to drink. Let's talk a little bit about what happens at the WTO. As I said, the United States on June the 3rd has asked the WTO to suspend a complaint over China's intellectual property practices for 6 months, and China agreed to that the next day. And then, according to news reports, China has also halted a dispute at the World Trade Organization over its claim to be a market economy on Monday. And this claim is targeted against the United States and the European Union, who have been refusing to recognize China's market economy status. Qinduo, what's going on here?
Well, it could be.
Is there any relation to the trade negotiations?
It might have something with the upcoming, let's say, relationship negotiation. China might prioritize, the issue now is really with the United States, probably putting aside this market economy status issue, and also it could be a tacit agreement on the two sides. If you are positive enough, if you are optimistic enough, you say China and the U.S. are both making goodwill gesture. I'm giving up my case against you. So basically,
right.
mutual gesture here.
Yeah, Brandon, what are you smelling here?
I think this is less about the United States and more about the rest of the world. China and the United States are back away from the World Trade Organization. First of all, the Trump administration doesn't respect it, doesn't understand its value. And I agree with Qinduo that would have been a much better venue for many of these disputes already. China, on the other hand, has been very smart. While the U.S. is treating the world as if trade between the U.S. and China is all that matters, China has been very carefully building relationships around the world. They were very quick to put tariffs against U.S. soybeans because they had an alternative in Brazil and South America. They were very quick to put tariffs on U.S. lobsters coming out of Maine because they knew they could get them from Canada. And lobsters in Maine have dropped 70% of their exports to China, a major market for them. So China is, I think, backing away from being quite as, so we say, oppositional at the World Trade Organization to start to say to the rest of the world, hey, if you guys want to play nice, we'll play nice, and we'll start actually just making better deals with the rest of you in a more multilateral, collaborative way, while we let the U.S. be over here being a lot more tough and a little bit, shall we say, from China's perspective, out of line.
All right, we're going to leave it there, and we'll see how things play out. Many thanks to Qinduo from the Pangoal Institution and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer from Grasshopper Group.